It began with footsteps in a holy place, not the soft shuffle of sandals, but the heavy rhythm of armed men crossing stone. Lamps shook along the corridor at Nob, where the priests kept watch, and outside, dust drifted in through the lintels as soldiers tightened a ring around the town. Someone shouted a name, Ahimelech. Someone else answered with the clatter of spearheads. In the tabernacle precinct, the air smelled of oil, fresh bread, and cedar. Prayers whispered there for generations were about to meet the noise of a king's fear. In those days, Saul ruled from Gibeah, and the shadow lengthening behind him was the name David. The shepherd who felled a giant, the captain who won battles the king could not, the musician whose harp once smoothed a troubled mind. He had fled the palace under a spear and a threat. Jonathan believed David's innocence. Saul did not. Jealousy composted into fear, and fear hardened into paranoia. Spies were sent. Rewards were promised. By the time David reached the priestly town of Nob, he was hungry, unarmed, and carrying more danger than he knew. Ahimelech the priest saw a young man shaking with fatigue and anxiety. He asked why David traveled without an escort and received a careful answer about urgent business. Mercy answered first. The priest set before him the consecrated bread, the loaves of the presence that had been taken from before the Lord, and then brought out a familiar weapon, the sword of Goliath, wrapped in cloth behind the ephod. "There is none like it," David said, and took it. Watching from the doorway that day was a man whose name would stain the record. Doeg the Edomite, chief of Saul's herdsmen, a stranger by blood, but very much at home in the court that fear ruled. Soon the court at Gibeah filled with complaint. Saul, brooding under a tamarisk tree with spear in hand, accused his servants of conspiring with the son of Jesse. No one had told him anything, he said, about oaths, about meetings, about his own son's loyalty to the fugitive. Doeg stepped forward at the moment anger begs for a witness. He told the king what he had seen at Nob, the priest Ahimelech giving David provisions and a weapon and inquiring of God for him. The report sounded neutral, the poison was in the timing. Ahimelech was summoned with other priests and stood before the throne. Saul's question was an indictment. "Why have you conspired against me?" You gave him bread and a sword and asked counsel of God for him. The priest answered plainly. David, he said, was the king's loyal servant, honored in the house, quick to obey. He had sought God for David many times before. If there was fault, it was ignorance, not treason. His words did not move the king. Saul heard only betrayal and pronounced a sentence that fell like a stone. Death. The guards stared at the floor. Soldiers who had faced Philistines and raiders could not lift their swords against men who wore linen ephods and spoke blessing over the people. Their refusal was the last good thing in that room, the boundary where conscience tried to hold the line between a king and his sin. Saul stepped past it by turning to the one man eager to please. "You, Doeg, turn and strike the priests." And Doeg did. Scripture gives the number without adornment. 85 priests who wore the linen ephod, cut down in a holy town. Doeg's obedience widened into zeal. He went to Nob with soldiers at his back and put the place to the sword, men and women, children and infants, oxen, donkeys, and sheep. The street where the bread of the presence had been baked fell quiet, except for doors knocking in their frames and the small noises of a community turned to wreckage. The writer tells it without gore because the horror is obvious. To linger would be smaller than the truth. Only one escaped. Abiathar, son of Ahimelech, ran and found David. He arrived with torn clothes and a story that landed like iron on David's heart. He told the fugitive about the summons, the accusation, the order, and the killing, and David said what he had feared the instant he saw Doeg at Nob. "I knew on that day that he would surely tell Saul. I have occasioned the death of all the persons of your father's house. Stay with me. Do not be afraid. With me, you shall be in safekeeping." It was not apology so much as ownership, a confession that righteousness can cast a shadow if it moves without wisdom. Doeg's place in memory is sealed not only by his sword, but by a song. David answered him with Psalm 52, a poem that reads like a courtroom speech. "Why do you boast of evil, O mighty man? The steadfast love of God endures all the day." It names the weapons Doeg used: sharp tongue, plotting heart, love of lies, and sets a verdict against them. God will break you down forever. He will snatch and tear you from your tent. The psalm ends with roots and green leaves in the courts of God, the image of endurance after a storm. It is the opposite of Nob, and that is the point. Judgment is slow enough to look like delay, and sure enough to feel like sunrise when it comes. What then of Saul, the king who gave the order but would not swing the blade? His story had begun with promise. The Spirit of the Lord had once rushed upon him. He had once stood small in his own eyes. But habit chipped at obedience until only theater remained. He spared what he was told to destroy. He blamed, excused, repented with words, then repeated the same rebellion with polish. By the time he called for the priests, he was living inside a logic that could justify anything done in the name of his throne. He would not strike the priests himself, yet he welcomed the man who would. In that distance between command and act, guilt did not thin, it thickened. The road out of the massacre winds through the rest of the book. It passes the cave of Adullam where outcasts joined David, and Engedi where the fugitive cut a corner from Saul's robe and would not cut flesh. It passes a witch at Endor, the last counsel Saul sought when God no longer answered him. It climbs Gilboa, where the king fell on his sword and his sons with him. And it keeps going toward a throne in Jerusalem, where David would reign and Abiathar would serve alongside Zadok until judgment forced another hard separation. Still, the scar at Nob remained, a line David could not erase even when the crown sat steady on his head. There is a bluntness in the narrative that refuses easy comfort. Nob was not a fortress or a rebel camp. It was a town shaped around a service at the tabernacle. To destroy it was to make war on the idea that holiness belongs in public life. The author of Samuel does not slow down to describe smoke and screams. It gives us the charge, the refusal, the substitute, the killing, and the one who ran. That economy is instructive. Scripture spends few words on spectacle and many on responsibility. The lesson is not how to stage a tragedy. It is how quickly power without obedience corrodes into crime. Divine crime is a double-edged phrase here. The victim served God. The murderer claimed to serve God's anointed. Zeal without truth sounds like devotion and acts like destruction. Doeg's efficiency did not make him righteous. Saul's crown did not make him just. The only clear moral voice after the slaughter belongs to the fugitive who accepts blame he did not intend and offers protection he can barely afford. That is an unsettling grace. The righteous do not get to excuse the harm their decisions set loose. They are called to shelter those who stand in the path of their choices. Stand then in the dust of Nob and listen for the opening footsteps again. They sound like every moment when fear outruns wisdom, when loyalty is tested in a way no conscience should pass, when an official desire is treated like a command from heaven. Out of that dust came a survivor, and a psalm, and a long pursuit that ended with a different kind of king. The priests who died without drawing a blade become, in the telling, a boundary as real as any wall, crossed once by a man who would not hear no, remembered forever by the God whose name they carried. Thank you for listening to Divine Crime. Subscribe for more true stories from the most dangerous book ever written.